The radio crackled with static as Dr. Sarah Chun pressed her back against the concrete wall of the abandoned medical clinic. Outside, the sounds of gunfire echoed through the dusty streets of Kandahar. She had been in Afghanistan for 6 months as part of a civilian medical team, treating wounded soldiers and local civilians caught in the crossfire of war. Sarah never imagined she would become the key to saving an entire SEAL team. At 32 years old, she was a trauma surgeon from San Francisco who had volunteered for this deployment after her younger brother was killed in action. She wanted to honor his memory by saving lives in the same dangerous places where he had fought. The morning had started like any other. Sarah was performing surgery on a wounded Afghan child when Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison burst through the clinic doors. His face was covered in dirt and sweat, and his uniform was torn. Behind him, 11 other Navy SEALs stumbled into the small medical facility, all of them injured in different ways. "Doc, we need your help," Morrison said, his voice urgent but controlled. "Our extraction point was compromised. Taliban forces have us surrounded, and we've got wounded men who can't move." Sarah quickly assessed the situation. The SEALs had been on a classified mission to capture a high-value target when everything went wrong. An informant had betrayed their location, and now they were trapped in the middle of enemy territory with no way out. Their helicopter couldn't land because of heavy enemy fire, and ground reinforcements were at least 6 hours away. The clinic was small and poorly equipped, but it was their only option. Sarah immediately went to work, triaging the wounded SEALs. 3 had serious gunshot wounds, 2 were suffering from shrapnel injuries, and the rest had various cuts and bruises from their harrowing escape through the city. As she worked on the most critically injured SEAL, a young man named Petty Officer Davis, who had taken a bullet to the chest, Sarah realized their biggest problem wasn't the wounds. It was their location. The clinic sat in the middle of a neighborhood that was completely controlled by Taliban fighters. Even if the SEALs were healthy, they couldn't fight their way out against such overwhelming numbers. "We need to think differently about this," Sarah told Morrison as she finished stabilizing Davis. "Fighting our way out isn't an option. There are too many of them, and half your men can barely stand." Morrison nodded grimly. He had reached the same conclusion. "What do you suggest, Doc?" Sarah had been working in this area for months, and she had built relationships with many of the local families. She spoke basic Pashto and understood the complex tribal dynamics of the region. More importantly, she had saved the lives of dozens of Afghan children and adults, earning respect even from families who opposed the American presence. "I have an idea," Sarah said, "but you're going to have to trust me completely. And your men are going to have to do something that goes against every instinct they have as SEALs." She explained her plan in whispers as Taliban fighters continued to search the surrounding buildings. The SEALs would have to disguise themselves as Afghan civilians and patients. Sarah would use her connections in the community to arrange safe passage through a network of families who owed her debts of gratitude. Morrison was skeptical. "Doc, these are Navy SEALs. We don't run and hide. We fight. And normally that's exactly what you should do," Sarah replied firmly. "But today, fighting means dying. All of you. Trust me, I've been here long enough to know when it's time to use brains instead of bullets." The first challenge was disguising 12 muscular, pale American soldiers as local Afghans. Sarah had been collecting traditional Afghan clothing for months to give to displaced families. She gathered every piece she could find: loose-fitting shower kameez tunics, pakal hats, and worn sandals. The transformation was almost comical under different circumstances. The SEALs, most of whom were over 6 feet tall with distinctly Western features, looked like giants in the traditional Afghan clothing. Sarah used medical gauze and tape to bind their hair and create makeshift beards using hair clippings she found in the clinic. "This is never going to work," muttered Petty Officer Rodriguez as he struggled to walk in the unfamiliar sandals. "We look like circus performers." "You look like wounded men seeking medical treatment," Sarah corrected. "That's exactly what you are. The key is to act the part. Keep your heads down, move slowly like you're in pain, and Let me do all the talking." While the SEALs changed clothes, Sarah contacted her network of local allies through a series of coded messages. She had saved the life of Haji Abdul Rahman's grandson the previous month, removing a piece of shrapnel that local doctors couldn't extract. Rahman was an elder whose family controlled several safe houses throughout the city. Within an hour, Rahman sent word through his network. He would help, but the escape had to happen in stages. Moving 12 large men at once would attract too much attention. They would have to split into smaller groups and travel through the city using different routes. The plan required perfect timing and absolute trust in people the SEALs had never met. Each group would be led by different Afghan families to various safe houses scattered throughout the city. From there, they would gradually make their way to an extraction point outside the city limits where a helicopter could safely land. Morrison gathered his men and explained the situation. "I know this goes against everything we've trained for, but Dr. Chun has risked her life to give us a chance. We follow her lead, and we all get home alive." The most seriously wounded SEALs would travel first, disguised as patients being transferred to another medical facility. Sarah would personally escort this group, using her reputation as a doctor to provide cover. The remaining SEALs would follow in smaller groups over the next several hours. As they prepared for the first movement, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. 13 American lives now depended on her understanding of local customs, her relationships with Afghan families, and her ability to think like a strategist rather than a surgeon. The sound of approaching vehicles made everyone freeze. Through the small window, Sarah could see Taliban trucks moving slowly down the street, searching every building. Time was running out, and their escape plan would have to begin immediately, ready or not. The first group consisted of Sarah, 3 of the most seriously wounded SEALs, and an elderly Afghan woman named Fatima, who had volunteered to help. Fatima's son had been one of Sarah's patients, and she felt obligated to repay the debt. The woman spoke perfect Pashto and knew every back alley in the neighborhood. Petty Officer Davis, still weak from his chest wound, was loaded onto a makeshift stretcher. The other 2 wounded SEALs, Petty Officer Williams and Sergeant Torres, could walk but needed assistance. Sarah had given them mild sedatives to help them appear genuinely sick and to keep them calm during the dangerous journey. As they prepared to leave the clinic, Sarah felt her heart racing. She had performed complex surgeries under pressure, but this was different. In the operating room, she controlled every variable. Here, she was depending on the goodwill of strangers and the hope that her months of building relationships would pay off when lives depended on it. Fatima whispered the route they would take. They would move through 3 different safe houses, spending only 15 minutes at each location before continuing. The final destination was a compound owned by Rahman's cousin, where they would wait for the helicopter extraction. The moment they stepped outside, Sarah realized how exposed they were. Taliban fighters were everywhere, stopping and questioning anyone who looked suspicious. The key was to move naturally, like a medical team transferring patients between facilities. Fatima walked ahead, her black burqa making her nearly invisible among the other women on the street. Sarah wore a hijab and loose clothing that concealed her Western features. The wounded SEALs leaned heavily on each other, groaning softly in what sounded like genuine pain. The first checkpoint came sooner than expected. 2 Taliban fighters stopped their small group, demanding to know where they were going. Fatima spoke rapidly in Pashto, explaining that these were wounded Mujahideen fighters being taken to a better medical facility. Sarah kept her eyes down and said nothing, knowing that her accent would immediately give her away. One of the fighters looked closely at Davis, who was pale and sweating from his wounds. For a terrifying moment, Sarah thought they would be discovered. Then Davis groaned convincingly and blood seeped through his bandages. The fighter, satisfied that these were genuinely wounded men, waved them through. The first safe house belonged to a baker named Ahmed, whose daughter Sarah had treated for appendicitis. Ahmed welcomed them quickly, ushering the group into a small room behind his shop. The smell of bread filled the air, and, for a moment, the situation felt almost normal. The Taliban are searching every building, Ahmed warned in broken English. They know Americans are hiding somewhere in the city. You must be very careful. While they rested, Sarah checked on her patients. Davis was holding up well, but his wound was still bleeding slightly. Williams had developed a fever, and Torres was struggling with pain from the shrapnel in his leg. She administered antibiotics and pain medication, working quietly while Ahmed kept watch. After exactly 15 minutes, Fatima signaled it was time to move again. The second leg of their journey would be the most dangerous, requiring them to cross a main street where Taliban patrols were most active. They waited for the call to prayer, when the street would be crowded with people heading to the mosque. Using the crowd as cover, they moved slowly across the open area. Sarah's training as a doctor had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but her hands were shaking as they walked past armed fighters who could discover their deception at any moment. The second safe house belonged to a family of carpet weavers. The elderly patriarch, Muhammad, had lost his grandson in a bombing, but Sarah had saved his granddaughter's life after the same attack. Muhammad's loyalty was absolute, and he had already prepared hiding places if the Taliban came to search his home. While they waited in the weaving room, surrounded by beautiful handmade carpets, Sarah received word through the network that the remaining SEALs were beginning their own escape routes. Morrison and Fermin were moving through the northern part of the city, while the final group of 4 was taking a longer route through the southern districts. Each group faced its own challenges. Morrison's team had nearly been caught when one of the SEALs, Petty Officer Jackson, had reacted instinctively to a child running into the street. His quick reflexes to protect the child were admirable, but completely wrong for someone supposed to be a wounded Afghan civilian. The southern group had different problems. 2 of the SEALs were over 6 feet 4 inches tall, making them stand out dramatically among the smaller Afghan population. Their guide, a teenager named Malik whose father Sarah had treated, had to find creative ways to keep them hunched over and moving through areas with low visibility. Back at Muhammad's house, Sarah faced a new crisis. Davis was getting worse, and his wound was showing signs of infection. She needed proper medical supplies to treat him, but leaving the safe house to find them would expose the entire group. Muhammad's daughter-in-law, a young woman named Zara who had been trained as a midwife, offered to help. She knew where to find black market medical supplies and could move freely through the city without attracting attention. Sarah gave her a list of antibiotics and surgical supplies, knowing that Davis might die without proper treatment. While Zara was gone, Taliban fighters began conducting a house-to-house search of the neighborhood. Muhammad quickly moved the Americans to a hidden basement beneath his shop, a space that had been used to hide weapons during the Soviet occupation decades earlier. The basement was cramped and dark, with barely enough room for 4 people. Sarah found herself pressed against Torres, who was trying not to cry out from the pain in his wounded leg. Davis was unconscious, which was probably a blessing given their circumstances. Above them, they could hear heavy footsteps and harsh voices as Taliban fighters searched Muhammad's house. Sarah held her breath, knowing that discovery would mean death not just for her and the SEALs, but for the entire Afghan family that had risked everything to help them. Muhammad's voice remained calm as he answered the fighters' questions. Yes, he had seen wounded men in the area. No, he didn't know where they had gone. Perhaps they had continued to the clinic across the city. His performance was flawless, the result of years of surviving in a war zone where the wrong answer could be fatal. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the Taliban fighters moved on to search other buildings. Muhammad waited another hour before signaling that it was safe to emerge from the basement. Zara had returned with the medical supplies, along with disturbing news. The Taliban had discovered that Americans were hiding in the city and had increased their patrols dramatically. All the escape routes were now being watched, and several Afghan families suspected of helping Americans had been arrested. Sarah realized their original plan was no longer viable. They would have to find a new way to reach the extraction point, and they would have to do it quickly before the Taliban net closed completely around them. As she worked to treat Davis's worsening infection, Sarah began developing a desperate new plan that would require even greater trust from the Afghan families helping them. Instead of trying to sneak through the city, they would have to hide in plain sight, using the one advantage they still possessed: her reputation as a doctor who had saved Afghan lives. Sarah's new plan was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of sneaking through the city, they would organize a fake medical emergency that would give them legitimate reasons to move through Taliban checkpoints. The key was making the emergency believable enough that even suspicious fighters would let them pass. She contacted Rahman through their secure communication network and explained what she needed. Within 2 hours, Rahman had arranged for his network to spread word throughout the city that Dr. Chun was organizing an emergency medical convoy to treat victims of a supposed bombing in a village outside Kandahar. The story was perfect because it was exactly the kind of mission Sarah had undertaken many times before. Taliban fighters knew her reputation and had often allowed her to pass through their territory to treat wounded civilians. This time, however, her patients would be 12 Navy SEALs disguised as Afghan bombing victims. Muhammad provided a large truck that he normally used for carpet deliveries. Zura and several other Afghan women volunteered to act as medical assistants, while Rahman's men would serve as drivers and security guards. To anyone watching, it would look like a typical humanitarian convoy heading to help civilian casualties. The challenge was gathering all 12 SEALs from their scattered hiding places and moving them to a central staging area without being detected. Sarah coordinated the movement like a complex surgical procedure, with precise timing and careful attention to every detail that could go wrong. Morrison's group was the first to arrive at the staging area, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. His men looked exhausted but determined. The stress of hiding and depending on strangers for survival had been almost as difficult as combat for these elite soldiers who were used to controlling their own fate. "How are the others doing?" Morrison asked Sarah as she checked his men for injuries. "Jackson's group made it to the second checkpoint, but they're being watched," Sarah replied. "The southern group is having trouble because Torres can barely walk. We may need to sedate him for the final movement." The last group didn't arrive until nearly midnight, and they brought bad news. Taliban fighters had arrested 3 Afghan families suspected of helping Americans. The enemy was getting closer to discovering the entire network, and they had very little time before the operation would be completely compromised. Sarah made the difficult decision to accelerate the timeline. Instead of waiting until dawn as originally planned, they would begin the medical convoy immediately. The risk was enormous, but staying in the city any longer would guarantee capture. The 12 SEALs were loaded into the back of the truck, lying on stretchers like genuine bombing victims. Sarah and Zara had used their medical skills to create realistic-looking wounds using blood, bandages, and makeup. The unconscious SEALs were given mild sedatives to keep them still, while the conscious ones were coached on how to groan and move like seriously injured men. Davis, who was genuinely injured and running a fever, didn't need to act. His pale complexion and labored breathing made him look exactly like someone who needed emergency medical attention. Sarah used his real condition to make the entire deception more believable. Rahman personally drove the truck, with 2 of his men riding as guards. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, wearing her medical coat and carrying legitimate medical documents that authorized her to travel anywhere in the region. She had used these same documents dozens of times for real medical emergencies. The first checkpoint was routine. The Taliban guard recognized Sarah and waved them through without even looking in the back of the truck. The second checkpoint was more thorough, but, again, Sarah's reputation provided safe passage. The third checkpoint changed everything. A new Taliban commander had taken control of this section of the city, and he was suspicious of everyone. He had not heard of Dr. Chun and demanded to inspect the wounded men personally. Sarah's heart pounded as the commander climbed into the back of the truck with a flashlight. The SEALs lay perfectly still as the commander examined them. His flashlight lingered on Williams, whose fair skin was barely concealed by the dirt and makeup Sarah had applied. For a terrifying moment, Sarah thought their deception had been discovered. Then Davis, delirious from fever, began speaking in what sounded like Pashto. Sarah realized he was repeating phrases he had learned during previous deployments, words of pain and confusion that sounded completely authentic to Afghan ears. The commander nodded sympathetically and backed out of the truck. "These men need immediate treatment," he told his guards. "Let them pass quickly." As they drove away from the checkpoint, Sarah felt weak with relief. Davis's genuine illness had saved them all. Sometimes the best deception was simply telling the truth in a different context. The convoy continued through the night, stopping at 2 more checkpoints without incident. By dawn, they had reached the extraction point, a flat area outside the city where helicopters could land safely. Rahman's men established a security perimeter while Sarah prepared her patients for evacuation. The rescue helicopters arrived exactly on schedule, 2 Black Hawks that swooped down from the morning sky like metal angels. Sarah had never been so happy to see American military aircraft. As the SEALs were loaded onto the helicopters, Morrison found Sarah and shook her hand firmly. "Doc, I don't know how to thank you. You saved all our lives without firing a single shot." "I just did what any doctor would do," Sarah replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Her actions had gone far beyond medical treatment, requiring courage, cultural understanding, and strategic thinking that had nothing to do with surgical training. Rahman and his network had risked everything to help American soldiers escape. Several Afghan families would have to leave the city permanently because their assistance was now known to the Taliban. Sarah arranged for these families to be evacuated along with the SEALs, ensuring that their sacrifice would not result in punishment or death. The helicopter ride back to base gave Sarah time to reflect on what had happened. She had always believed that medicine was about saving lives, but she had never imagined that her healing skills would extend to outmaneuvering an entire enemy army. The official report would describe the rescue as a successful extraction operation, but Sarah knew the real story was more complex. It was about the power of relationships built over months of patient care, the courage of Afghan civilians who chose to help strangers, and the willingness of elite soldiers to trust someone completely outside their world of warfare. Weeks later, Sarah received word that all 12 SEALs had made full recoveries. Davis sent her a personal letter thanking her not just for saving his life, but for teaching him that sometimes the greatest strength came from knowing when not to fight. The mission had taught everyone involved that victory didn't always require weapons or violence. Sometimes it required understanding, compassion, and the willingness to see enemies as human beings who might choose cooperation over conflict when given the right reasons. Sarah remained in Afghanistan for another year, continuing to treat wounded soldiers and civilians. But she never forgot the night when she learned that healing could take many forms and that sometimes the most important battles were won not through fighting, but through the simple act of one person choosing to help another, regardless of the risks involved. The 12 SEALs returned to active duty, but they carried with them a deeper understanding of the complexity of modern warfare. They had learned that in places like Afghanistan, survival often depended more on cultural intelligence than military strength, and that the most valuable allies could come from the most unexpected sources. For Sarah, the experience confirmed her belief that medicine was ultimately about human connection. Whether she was performing surgery or organizing an elaborate escape plan, the core principle remained the same. When people needed help, you found a way to provide it, no matter how impossible the circumstances might seem.